Hey, what's going on, gang? This is Nate on the Stone, and welcome to the 20th episode of the Rolling Stone. And as you know, these are the videos where I give my initial thoughts and reactions to stories that are currently in the news. And the first story that we're talking about this week in this episode concerns Ilhan, Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, half of the squad, right? So, what happened? Ilhan, Omar, and Rashida Tlaib were planning a trip to Israel, okay? They were going to make a tour of Israel. And everything was set to go. Israel had said that yes, they could come, even though Omar and Tlaib have become very well known for criticizing Israel, not being exactly the warmest friends. I would even go so far as to say not even being fair. But then President Trump got on Twitter, as he is wont to do, and he said this, okay, quote, "It would show great weakness if Israel allowed Representative Omar and Representative Tlaib to visit. They hate Israel and all Jewish people, and there is nothing that can be said or done to change their minds. Minnesota and Michigan will have a hard time putting them back in office. They are a disgrace." After Trump sent out that tweet, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually reversed the prior decision and said that Omar and Tlaib were not going to be allowed to come into Israel. And the usual suspects had the usual predictable reactions. So, Ilhan Omar, she called Israel's decision an affront. Rashida Tlaib said that Israel's decision, okay, barring a U.S. Congresswoman, is a sign of weakness because the truth of what is happening to Palestinians is frightening. Presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren, she got on board and she said on Twitter, quote, "Israel doesn't advance its case as a tolerant democracy or unwavering U.S. ally by barring elected members of Congress from visiting because of their political views. This would be a shameful, unprecedented move." Nancy Pelosi said that it was beneath the dignity of Israel. This decision was beneath Israel's dignity. But as is so often the case, there were other facts that were conveniently left out of the narrative. So, writing at the New York Post, Michael Goodwin actually chronicled some of these other facts. For example, what wasn't mentioned was that there was another group of congressmen from Republicans and Democrats that was being planned to actually go to Israel and do whatever members of Congress do when they go to Israel, right? Omar and Tlaib actually refused to be a part of that group. They were going to go on their own. They were going to have a private trip. And like Goodwin asked, what was bad, about this other group that was going to have Republicans and Democrats on it, both parties, right? What was so bad about it? Furthermore, for their private trip, Omar and Tlaib, it was later discovered, actually refused any government briefings about the current state, what's been going on in Israel and between Israel and the Palestinians on the West Bank. Completely refused them. Plus, we found out that their itinerary, it actually only listed that they were going to be visiting Palestine, which is a country that doesn't even exist. Now, I mean, we can think that that's a good thing, that that's a bad thing, that's an indifferent thing, but right now, the geopolitical reality is that there is no country called Palestine, okay? And yet their itinerary said that their trip consisted of going to Palestine, okay? A country that doesn't exist. It should also be noted right now that Palestine is often a word used by ideologues who want to deny statehood to Israel, okay? Take that however you want. Now, furthermore, okay, the group that was planning, okay, that was actually sponsoring Omar and Tlaib's trip, okay, is a group called MIFTAH, M-I-F-T-A-H. It is the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy. And it is a group that has actually defended terrorism against Israel, okay? So, according to Fox News, in 2006, a MIFTAH report dealing with the Second Intifada, which was a wave of Palestinian violence in the early 2000s, it discussed a 2002 Jerusalem suicide bombing under a section titled Fighting Back. It described the attack where Wafa Idris blew herself up with a bomb that killed an Israeli and injured more than 100 others. And it described this attack as the beginning of a string of Palestinian women dedicated to sacrificing their lives for the cause. Okay, so definitely this MIFTA group that was sponsoring Omar and Tlaib's private trip to Israel has, black and white, they have defended suicide bombers. Okay, suicide bombers whose stated goal is actually going over and blowing up innocent Israeli civilians. Okay, women and children. Okay, this group defended that. Furthermore, more recently, this is still from Fox News, more recently, MIFTA's founder, Hanan Ashrawi, a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Executive Committee, spoke against referring to Palestinian attackers as terrorists in a 2017 interview. And this Hanan Ashrawi, she said this, quote, "They are seen by the people as resistance, and you cannot somehow adopt the language of either the international community or the occupier by describing anybody who resists as a terrorist," saying that if you do that, that is unfair and unjust. So, you can be a terrorist. You can go over, strap bombs onto yourself, go over there and blow up a bus full of kids, full of women and kids, innocent civilians, but since they are resisting, okay, calling them terrorists is unfair and unjust. And look, I don't care right now if you are pro-Israel, anti-Israel, if you're kind of in the middle, you've got questions, you're critical of Israel. I think that we should all be able to agree that even if legitimate resistance is called for, that acts of terrorism, strapping a bomb onto yourself and then blowing up kids, blowing up women, blowing up innocent men and women who are not part of the military, that is an act of terrorism. I think we should all be able to be on the same page on that part, okay? And there's also just the fact that Omar and Tlaib are, like I said, they are very clearly anti-Israel. So Omar called Israel, she's called Israel an apartheid state, even though that is not true whatsoever. There are, several thousand black Israelis living in Israel right now. Plus there are, several thousand Muslims in Israel who are Israeli citizens who have all the same rights as Israeli. So calling it an apartheid state, trying to draw a comparison between Israel and South Africa, where there was very clear racism in the South African government. Before it changed, where blacks were kept very separate from whites, apartheid, separation. Trying to draw that comparison is bogus, and it's completely ideologically driven. It's a lie. Not only that, but infamously back in May of this year, Rashida Tlaib said on Yahoo's podcast Skullduggery, quote, "There's always kind of a calming feeling, I tell folks, when I think of the Holocaust and the tragedy of the Holocaust and the fact that it was my ancestors, Palestinians, who lost their land, as some lost their lives, their livelihood, their human dignity, their existence in many ways have been wiped out, and some people's passports, etc." So, okay, she said, it gives her a calming feeling thinking about the Holocaust. Now, whether she actually meant that or not, I think that we can all say that that was a very poor choice of words, which I do not think she's really apologized for or said, hey, you know what, I did not adequately express myself, that was my bad, okay? So, you have these two congresswomen who are not the best friends of Israel, who refused to go on a trip with their fellow members of Congress. Their private trip only listed them going to see Palestine, a country that doesn't exist, and it was being sponsored by a group that has publicly defended terrorist attacks against Israel, okay? And yet, when Israel says that, no, you're not allowed in, they're the bad guys. Israel is the bad guys. In fact, Ilhan Omar has actually suggested that Israel should be punished for not allowing her and Tlaib to go on their trip, okay? She said that the U.S. should actually significantly reduce the aid that we give Israel so that they'll be punished, so that they know that they can't get away with this. Now, What does this all mean? Well, first of all, to me, this definitely shows a sense of imperialism. The old system of where you would have the one country who was much stronger going into another country that was much weaker, and then basically bossing that country around, exploiting them for whatever natural resources they had, labor, etc., right? Basically making them a satellite of your nation. And yeah, that's kind of that's pretty much the definition of imperialism, okay? Especially with some schools of historians. So, the funny thing about this, first of all, is that Israel is its own sovereign nation, right? Again, like I said, whether you agree with that or whether you don't, or whether you have reservations about Israel, the plain geopolitical fact on the ground right now is that Israel is its own sovereign nation. So they can decide who they want to let in and who they don't want to let in. So Omar and Tlaib going around saying that they have the right as members of Congress to go into a foreign sovereign nation, and that somehow them being barred from doing that is somehow an assault on them, and it's an affront, it's a attack on their rights. This is pure imperialism. Okay? This is supposed to be the United States, the stronger country, bullying the smaller, weaker country because two members of Congress did not get their way. And I want to re-emphasize on that, okay? Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they are not ambassadors, they're not diplomats, they're not attached to the State Department in any way, which does a lot of foreign policy, okay? They are just two members of Congress. They're freshman members of Congress. They represent their congressional districts in Congress, and that's it. They don't represent the rest of us. They do not represent the United States government, okay? Each individually, Omar and Tlaib, they are 1/435th of 1/2 of 1/3 of one level of the U.S. government. We've got the federal government, state governments, and then local governments. They're just part of the federal government. Okay, so that's how I get it. 1/435th of 1/2 of 1/3 of one level of the government. Okay, they are not the bigwigs. They are not the people in charge. I know that they have a lot of cultural power. The New York Times declared them to be the face of the Democratic Party now, and they do have a lot of power and a lot of influence, and they are molding and shaping the Democrat Party much more closely to align with their ideology. But in an international context, they have just an infinitesimal amount of power just because based on who they are, okay? They're freshman congresswomen, okay, from two separate congressional districts. That's it. So this idea that, the United States should punish Israel for doing something which it has every right to do is imperialistic, which also shows apparently that the left doesn't actually mind imperialism. The left makes a very big deal about how bad imperialism is and about how it's unjust and it's terrible and, it's exploitive. And you know what? In a lot of cases of imperialism, that's true. But apparently, they only don't like the wrong kind of imperialism, the imperialism that doesn't get them what they want. Because when it's something that they want or something that they think will get them what they want, then be imperialistic all day long until the cows come home. It doesn't matter. And there's one more thing about this story. This really shows a monarchial mindset. Okay, it's a permutation of the divine rights of kings that was so popular, especially in the later Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and then in the 18th century. It really took off there, because the idea that Omar and Tlaib seem to be operating under is, since they were elected as representatives, again, just of their own districts, then they have somehow become the voice of God, and that they have the right to enter any country that they want, no matter what they've said, no matter who their trip is being sponsored by, no matter what their itinerary is, damn what's best actually for that foreign sovereign nation and, what's best for it and its people, right? No. They have the right to go wherever they want because they are now members of Congress, right? God has smiled upon them, and that gives them carte blanche to do whatever they want. And this is important because it is unseemly in a Republican society, like we're supposed to be. It is unseemly in a Republican society for people, especially members of Congress, elected leaders, elected by us, the people, right, to represent them. We went through a whole bloody revolution, okay, to say that the monarchial mindset is not what we want, and it is not, in fact, the best of what people should aspire to. In a Republican society, we are all supposed to be equal before the law and before God, and then the only mark of distinction, in theory again, is supposed to be merit, hard work, and perseverance. That's it. But this monarchical mindset, it completely wipes that off of the board. And like I said, it is especially worrisome, scary, and revealing when two members of Congress, again, who haven't even been there like for 20 or 30 years, and they can, kind of stretch out and say, you know what, I've kind of earned my stripes. I'm one with the people. They like me. I've been here a while. These are freshman members of Congress. And the fact that they have this monarchical mindset only less than a year into their term of office, very, very revealing and not a good sign of the future. But that is story number one. Our second story actually takes us to New York City, okay, where a member of the New York Police Department, the NYPD, Daniel Pantaleo, has been fired from the NYPD. Now, what's the big deal about this? Well, we have to go back into the Wayback Machine to 2014. In 2014, this officer, Daniel Pantaleo, and his partner, they went to Long Island because store owners on Long Island, they were complaining about a specific man named Eric Garner. They said that Garner was selling cigarettes illegally, on their storefronts. Violation of New York City's laws, okay? And they said, hey, we want the police to come and do something. So, Pantaleo, they went over there, they found this man who was illegally selling the cigarettes, Eric Garner, and by the way, Garner had a previous record. He had been arrested several times for this in spite of warnings to knock it off. Don't sell these illegal cigarettes, right? Garner actually started resisting arrest. He basically said, no, I'm not coming with you. Please, I don't want to do this. Just leave me alone, okay? So, he was resisting arrest. The officers were trying to actually, subdue him, to get him under arrest. Now, Pantaleo says that he went for a seatbelt hold behind Garner. The two of them went to the ground, and when they went to the ground, Pantaleo's arm went up, okay, to Garner's neck, okay? And then he died. Eric Garner died, okay? And this is what the whole thing has been about, because it has been argued that Pantaleo was using excessive force against Garner. He, deliberately used a chokehold on Garner, which is prohibited, okay? New York police officers are not allowed to use chokeholds on suspects, even when they're trying to subdue them, even when they're trying to arrest them. That is illegal. They're not supposed to do that, okay? I should also mention that the reason why Pantaleo went for the seatbelt hold in the first place is because Eric Garner was a big man, okay? He was 6'3" and 350 pounds, okay? Very, very big. Now, of course, this has been much like in Ferguson in 2014. These both happened the same year, curiously enough. This has been, a corruption of police power, a white officer, attacking a black man. Eric Garner was black. And so, that has been the narrative that has been formed and weaved around this story. However, again, Pantaleo has never been indicted, and he's not going to be facing any sort of criminal charges. Why? Because there is no evidence. So, according to the New York Post, which has been doing a lot on this story, okay, medical examiners, medical reports were not in agreement on whether Pantaleo actually was doing a chokehold on Gardner or not, but they all agreed, all the medical reports agreed that Gardner was not in the best of health. He suffered from asthma, he was obese, and he had heart disease, and they all said that is probably what killed him. And in fact, the chief medical officer of St. Louis said his death was a result of medical issues when he started wrestling with the officers trying to resist arrest. You know, all of these different factors, the obesity, the heart disease, and the asthma, they all just kind of kicked together, and that's what killed him. It should also be noted that the EMTs who came onto the scene to try to revive Gardner after he went down, after he was unresponsive, they did not do their job. They failed to administer proper treatment when they came, okay? So what has all this meant? It meant that the grand jury declined to indict Pantaleo, the Department of Justice and the local FBI and the federal prosecutors all said that no charges were going to be filed. But this week, he was fired from the NYPD, which was the only thing that could happen to him now, because everyone said there are going to be no criminal charges filed against him because there's no evidence. The only thing that could happen was that he was going to be kicked off the force. And that's actually what happened this week, okay? So, Governor Chris Cuomo, Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York City, and our old friend Senator Elizabeth Warren all said that he should be fired, okay? He should be fired in spite of the evidence, okay? But even though he hadn't done anything wrong, he should still have been fired. And de Blasio even went so far as to say that justice was done in kicking off this poor guy off of the force. Justice was done. Again, there is no evidence whatsoever that Pantaleo did anything wrong. That's why he's not going to be indicted, okay, by anybody. But even though there is no evidence, de Blasio said him getting fired, that was justice. That was the right thing to do, okay? But here's the thing. In fact, here's the first thing out of several things. New York law actually explicitly carves out protections for cops engaged in good faith enforcement. It allows for heat-of-the-moment errors of judgment, for accidents, and for unhappy outcomes. So, in other words, as someone put it, it allows for human frailty. So even though, okay, so here's the scenario. Even though there is no evidence that Pantaleo did anything wrong, and even though New York law actually protects NYPD officers from, the mistakes that they can make in the heat of the moment when they're trying to, get a suspect into custody, someone who is trying to resist arrest, despite all of that, Pantaleo was punished by having his badge taken away from him. Okay, that is the opposite of what Bill de Blasio said. That's not justice. That is an injustice. Now, my thoughts on this are, first of all, this shows the politicization of the police. Okay, now, there have been a few commentators in the past, such as Mark Steyn, whom I greatly respect and admire. He's one of my heroes, Mark Steyn is, who has said for a while that one of the problems that we face, in postmodern America is the militarization of the police. Now, I think that that's true, but I also think that that is a separate problem. We have the militarization of the police, and at the same time, as this story shows, we have the politicization of the police. Because here's the situation. When you have a scenario when an officer does nothing wrong, and when even the law itself, acts as sort of a shield around him, so if he makes a mistake in, we might say, in the heat of battle, he's not going to be fried for it, right? When both of those things, okay, the lack of evidence and the actual protection in the heat of the moment are completely disregarded, and he's just punished to make a political point, okay? How many people are actually going to be encouraged to seek out a future in law enforcement? How many people are going to devote themselves actually to law enforcement, to law and order, to servicing and protecting people when they know that their bosses, the city governments, don't have their back? Okay, now that's a pretty big problem to have, because I know it's very fashionable today with Antifa and all to say pretty much, F the police, and we're going back to the 70s, police are pigs and police are fascists, etc., etc. But every sort of civilization, every sort of society needs a police force. You need a band of people who enforce the laws of the society, okay? They are in charge of enforcing the laws. They are in charge of arresting people, taking off the streets of people who break the laws, so that all the rest of us have a chance not just to live in peace and order, but so that justice can actually be done. Because if the police actually don't do this, if there is no police force, then what happens? We've got vigilantism. And vigilantism, okay, I mean, since this isn't a comic book, vigilantism very often morphs into just whoever is holding the biggest stick, is the law in his area. So now we just have rule by force, which is not good under any sort of circumstances. So there's that. And this was definitely a political move. There was another story in the New York Post, which interviewed some police officers, and they said, oh yeah, this was complete politics. Pantaleo was basically a lamb sacrificed for political convenience, because this case has been brewing for 5 years, okay? Like I said, this incident happened in 2014. It's been brewing for 5 years. Why did the New York City police commissioner all of a sudden just decide to fire Pantaleo, even after no charges were being filed against him, after he wasn't even going to be indicted? It's because of politics. Because guess who's running for president? Bill de Blasio. And this isn't even a New York issue. At the second Democrat debate, people actually sort of interrupted the debate, demanding that Pantaleo be fired. In fact, Elizabeth Warren actually came out and said Pantaleo should be fired, okay? She's not a senator from New York. She has nothing to do with New York. She's from Massachusetts. But even people who are not associated with New York City or New York State or anything, because it's an election year and because it's a white officer who was trying to arrest a black suspect who then died, and that's the narrative that this thing is taking on, it is political gold for ideologues, especially in regards to intersectional identity. So this was definitely a political move, make no doubt about it. But there is something else that this shows us, and it's the perversion of politics, okay? We talked about it, I think, on a previous episode of The Stone, and I mentioned that politics is the art of the possible. That's true. But more than that, going deeper than that, politics is also about promoting the common good. What if you want to get really heady, what philosophers call the common good. What is good for all of us, because we are all human beings, okay? That is what politics is supposed to be about. And one of the two things that we need for the common good and for, an actual good society that everyone wants to live in and be happy under is order and justice, okay? But like we just said, justice is getting completely kicked to the curb in this case, right? So what's the point of politics if you're not going to promote the common good, if you're not even going to pretend to make an effort to promote the common good? Well, like we saw here, and again, hearkening back to that point that this was just a pure, cynical political move, this is what happens. This is the perversion of politics. Politics not to enforce the common good or to promote the common good, politics simply to gain power, okay? Now, when that becomes the end-all and be-all of politics, and when not even an attempt is made to hide that fact, that means that you have a very, very sick society. You don't have a Republican society anymore, and in fact, you don't even have a good society anymore, because now everyone is either an emperor or a pawn. And so everyone had better be fighting to become an emperor, get as much power as they can so that they can rule the roost and form that wall around themselves and enforce their will against everyone else. But anyway, that is story number 2. And our third and final story for this week's episode of The Rolling Stone has to do with the movie maker Spike Lee. And this past Tuesday on Breitbart, there was a story about Spike Lee. And Spike Lee was quoted in the story on Breitbart as saying that woke historians all know that the United States was formed by genocide and slavery. Okay, and what I really want to do with this last story is I really want to hone in on that phrase, woke historians, because Spike Lee is not calling for historians. Okay, he might say that woke, we need historians, or woke historians all know this. He's not calling for historians. Okay, he's calling for propagandists, because you cannot be woke and be a historian at the same time. Okay, woke today, it means that you are awake, right? You are aware. You know, for example, that the patriarchy is real. You know about intersectional identity politics and the truth of intersectional identity politics, right? You know that there is still systematic racism in the country. You know, in fact, that just the fact of a person being white, means that they are implicitly racist towards black people. Like religions like Christianity, they are just nothing but fonts of bigotry and oppression, etc., etc., etc. That are all elements of what woke means. That means that if you are woke, you are approaching life from a decidedly ideological point of view. Okay? That is the exact opposite of what it means and what is needed to be a historian. Okay? Because the historian, he is supposed to sit down and he is supposed to look at events and facts and ideas. He is supposed to look at the words that the dead wrote. And from that, he is supposed to come to an objective judgment about the past, or an objective decision. He is supposed to be able to say, this is what it was like in the past. The past thought like this because of all of this. They said this because of this. This happened because of this, okay? History is not supposed to be ideological. In fact, it is not supposed to be ideological. Once you start becoming ideological in terms of history, you're not really doing history anymore, okay? You're becoming an apologist. You are becoming a propagandist. Even, I would go so far to say. Now, that's not to say that every historian is objective, above board, and has a clear and level head. Not at all. Everyone has their prejudices and their biases, and you've got to be aware of them as you're doing your job. Some people, both professional historians and people who lay moniker to the title of historian, they don't even pretend to be objective. They definitely have an agenda and they just hammer it away. It's kind of like a Christian movie, sad to say, where, the point is just to get the message across no matter what. So it doesn't matter what has to be left out of the historical records. It doesn't matter what facts or what words have to be twisted and rearranged and really looked at through a very specific lens. It doesn't matter as long as the agenda is pushed forward, okay? There are some people like that, definitely. And there are definitely schools of history, different schools where you interpret facts and events through a specific lens or specific paradigms. That is not being ideological, I don't think, because everyone needs a framework for the facts. A historian, though, is supposed to be objective enough to, when he finds evidence that contradicts the paradigms of his particular school, if he has one, he can actually break free of that historical school. Okay, that specific way of looking at things to take in this new evidence into account. Okay. So that is what a historian is supposed to do. Now, you might be asking, Nate, why is that important? Okay, why is that important, and why is what Spike Lee said so important that it deserves its whole section here in this episode? Well, it's important because of the role that the historian plays in society. Every society has actually had historians. Okay, the ancient Greeks, Herodotus, He's the father of history, but it goes back further than that. The ancient Egyptians had historians, okay? There were sons of pharaohs who were amateur Egyptologists and historians because Egyptian civilization was so freaking long that, you know, people in the 20th dynasty were like, well, why did people in the 4th dynasty think like this? Or how did they do that? So every society, okay, the point is every society has had, in some form or fashion, they have had historians. And the reason why that they have had historians is because the role of the historian is not just sort of a recorder. He is sort of the link between the present and the past, okay? The past is a foreign country. It's very, very different. But at the same time, we need the past because that's where we come from. Our roots are in the past. Everything, you know, the world we live in today is a product of the past. So not only can we not understand where we are, you know, without understanding the past, we can't really understand who we are without understanding the past. The past allows us to, you know, touch our roots. It allows us to understand who we are, where we came from, and kind of give us an idea of where we're going. It gives us a sense of identity. Okay, which is very important for a country, a civilization, a culture, and a people. Because without that, you're even worse than a person with Alzheimer's. Someone once described changing history as someone with Alzheimer's disease. It's worse than that because a person with Alzheimer's disease, their soul is the same even though their brain is deteriorating from the inside. When you try to change history, when you try to warp history, you are actually changing the soul of a country. You're making it completely different from what it was supposed to be, etc. So it's even worse than that. So that is the importance of the historian. The historian is sort of a conduit between the past and the present, and he is able to allow the two to meet. So the people in the present can remember who they are and where they came from, and from that also remember what direction they're supposed to go, or based on the past, if they should go in a different direction, right? That is the real importance of the historian. But like I said, when it becomes corrupted by ideology, like with woke historians, then that entire premise, that entire conduit is corrupted and it's worthless because now the historian isn't acting as a bridge between the past and the present. In fact, the historian is taking an active part and he is twisting the history of the past. He is twisting the past, what they did, how they thought, what they said, in order to push a country or a civilization or a people in a specific direction. And that's why Spike Lee's saying woke historians, oh no. First of all, it's not worth the paper it's printed on, because if you're a woke historian, you are ideologically compromised and everything that you say should be taken with a bag of salt. Second of all, you know, if you're a woke historian, right, which means you're on the right side of history, well then everyone, all the historians should be woke because everyone wants to be on the right side of history. But what that means is that we're not going to be doing history anymore. We're just going to be doing propaganda. And you do not remember who you are or where you came from with propaganda. In fact, you are just actively blindfolding people and saying, this is what happened, this is what we're saying happened because we're the experts, and now because of that, you have to go in this way. It's not history. And if that actually becomes the norm, if people actually, you know, take that idea and run with it, we need woke historians. Woke historians are the ones we should listen to. Then we're not going to have history anymore. And we will be a country, a civilization that has actually lost its soul. And that is going to be a Frankenstein monsterish nightmare to live in. But anyway, as usual, I have talked for too long, so I am going to cut off the video here. Happy Friday, have a great weekend, gang, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Ciao.